So last time we covered up to what 1983, I suppose, when gaming was a $3 billion plus industry.
Yeah,
But we mentioned that dark days were coming.
the darkest.
Yeah. There was a gaming crash in 1983, which is also called the Atari Shock. Um,
I've never heard it called that actually.
yeah, I I think it's a bit of a harsh title because it wasn't specific to Atari. But anyway, um, this was yeah, a crash in the industry which lasted from 83 to 85, and it was mostly because of saturation of the market with poor products.
Mm. And loads of clones of the same game, just slightly misnamed,
Yeah.
renamed, sorry, on various consoles that all did the same thing. The saturation of the market, it wasn't just games. It was even the consoles were just also similar.
Yeah.
And of course, there was no real pre-internet. There was no way of parents knowing
Mm.
what the difference was and what was good, what was bad. And also, I suppose they wouldn't have had any comparison at all because it was
No.
sort of the first generation of that sort of
Yeah.
gaming.
It was the first time, video games have really been in homes. So I mean, a lot of it was there was no real quality control. That was the big problem. It was games were popular, but that didn't mean they were good. So you tended to have big name titles which were just poor games.
Which
The-
still happens today.
Which still, yes, happens today. But I mean, one of the games which is often pointed to was E.T., the Extraterrestrial,
Yeah.
which is, of course, one of the biggest films of all time. Came out in 1982, and they wanted to cash in on that.
Mhm.
It was an Atari game, and it's often called the worst video game ever. It's not,
No.
but it is bad.
Last Action Hero on the Mega Drive. LA.
Yeah.
I think the problem with it was it was poorly designed, but
Mm.
no more, and quite sort of obscure in what you had to do.
Mm.
It was, I suppose, it was one of the we mentioned before with Indiana Jones on the Atari is just as sort of oblique.
Yeah.
It's just for some reason it's not regarded in the same way. But I think not the problem was the issue was that it went the Atari and all those sort of era. We'll focus on the Atari for now, but the Atari say went from being single screen games onto these sort of basically are reaching their grasp with adventure games like Indiana Jones and E.T. and this multi-screen, and of course they didn't have the graphical capability to represent what the images and items were supposed to be, which made it difficult from the start. You needed the manual,
Yeah.
or you were stuck.
Because up until that point, of course, I mean, we mentioned last time things like Space Invaders, Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, single screen games, and it was
It's
pretty
quite clear
it's straightforward what you
don't
have
let
to do.
anything hit you, and if you can shoot at the things that are shooting
Yeah.
you.
But then you come across something like Indiana Jones,
Yeah.
which was, well, I'll let you explain what Indiana Jones
I wa-
looks and sounds like, and
It's sort of I've only ever sort of seen it. I haven't actually played it, but as an example of just the difficulty and how a child, especially at that time, would pick up a game and just think, "Oh, this is crap." You're sort of Indiana Jones, you're like a stick man with a hat on, and each screen has like a solid color background, and you have an inventory, which was pretty unique at the time, I think. And then you sort of, but the game starts, and if you walk down the bottom of the screen, it's just an instant death. You just fall, and it turns out through a confusing series of events that you have to get a rope, which is illustrated by three diagonal squares that you have to have in your inventory and use at the bottom of the screen so you can go down on the other screen.
it's just impenetrable.
Yeah, and all this. I mean, like I said, I've only ever seen it on YouTube, but when you look at the illustrations in the manual and what they're represented as in the game, if you didn't have the manual, you'd have no idea what the gun looked like or a crucifix or it's just really. And I think that was the problem with ET as well. It's like I say, it's badly designed, but it's not the worst game.
No.
You know.
But we have played ET, and it is
Yeah.
bad, and
Oh, yeah.
it's impossible to really understand what you're doing. But there is a reason for this. The reason why it's a bad game is because basically they wanted to cash in on it, and they gave one man 5.5 weeks, under 6 weeks, to completely program it on his own, in order so they could get it out for the
What's
holiday
his name?
season.
Howard Scott Warshaw.
Yes, I
That is
think
his
so.
name,
Yeah.
right? Sorry, that was.
So, it was famously given this label as worst game ever made, but more than anything, I think it represented something about the games industry at the time. Big film tie-in, lazily converted to a game, and it was such a massive flop that they ended up burying a lot of the copies under the Mexican desert.
Yeah, and there was a documentary last year about that.
Yeah, which have obviously become very rare and collector's items. So yeah, I mean, there are other cheap cash-ins such as like Superman, astonishing.
Spider-Man. Yeah,
Spider-
just as
awful.
impenetrable.
Yeah.
Just as impenetrable.
So it was kind of the death knell for gaming, really. I mean, and a lot of people bear in mind that this was the first really like popular generation of
Wave,
video games
yeah.
consoles. So it was very real prospect that it could have just been a flash in the pan, and actually it was just a phase. But
And everyone goes back to playing Hero Quest.
yeah, exactly. So, but actually, it didn't turn out that way because in 1985, a little company called Nintendo stepped up to the plate. Now, I've done a little bit of research on this. Nintendo actually literally means leave luck to heaven,
Really?
which
That's
is
the
pretty
translation
cool.
of- yeah.
It's a pretty cool meaning because, of course, it means skill.
It's
And-
unlike the Japanese to love a proverb.
So Nintendo actually originated as a playing card company in the 19th century. Their first kind of foray for the home video game market was Game & Watch handheld devices.
Oh, yes.
Can you describe a Game & Watch handheld device, Britt?
Yeah, a Game & Watch. You were sort of little handheld things about the size of what would be the size of a sort of phone now, I suppose, with sort of a grey screen. And it was the best way to describe the graphics for what they were. The same sort of style as early Casio watches, black and grey. And it was usually just simple stuff like there would be someone throwing bananas down from the top of the screen and you move left and right with two buttons to collect them. And they got more and more advanced with double screens and so on. But I think the more advanced they got, the
less playable?
Yeah, less playable.
Okay, I mean, the idea...
And they had blips and beeps for sound effects.
Yeah, apparently the idea came from someone at Nintendo watching a businessman on a train one day playing with a pocket calculator.
Playing with a calculator.
Yeah, he must have been bored. Or maybe he was just writing the word boobies upside down.
Tithering as he turned it upside down.
But anyway, that's what they were doing, and they were successful enough. But their first home console, Nintendo's first home console, was the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1985.
That's a hell of a first.
I know.
outing.
And I mean, you'll know the Nintendo Entertainment System. Everyone knows it, even if they don't know it, if you know what I mean, because it's got the classic squared off controller and of course classic games, which we'll come to. But the reason why why the NES, as it's known, revolutionized gaming and perhaps saved gaming in the Western world.
I was actually just trying to think before you came in, what if E.T. was, I know the film was released in 1982, but was the game in 1983 or?
I think it was 1982. Maybe I'm pretty sure they wanted to rush it out for holiday season, so it would have been.
So that means that if the NES came along in 1985, there was a 2-year gap where there was pretty much nothing.
Well, yeah, and it's if you read up about the gaming crash, it's 83 to 85 because it was only in 85 when it was really felt as such, like the ramifications of it, and that's when the NES came out. But actually, even the NES hit its peak in 87, so it wasn't for a little while.
It was a slow increase.
Yeah. So, but what the NES and Nintendo really did, which effectively reversed the trend of cheap, poor games flooding the industry, was introduce the seal of quality, frankly, and it's still on Nintendo games today. And I mean, okay, well, how much it really means, not sure, but it did definitely mean something back then, because
I'm not sure if it was on Bayou Billy on the NES.
Yeah, well, I mean, but in a way, just the console itself represented something about the quality of gaming, because, I mean, okay, there were some absolute duds, but there's some brilliant key games on the NES. Yeah, which remain playable today. So obviously you have like Super Mario Brothers, for instance, which was a breakthrough in platform gaming, and
which also had, I think, it was the first Mario game released on the Atari.
Oh, maybe.
I've got a copy on the Atari. I think that was 83.
All right. Wow. So, I mean, this Donkey Kong was obviously a great platform game, but it was single
like an
screen.
arcade port,
Yeah. now the screen was scrolling and there were multiple routes and different baddies to beat. So yeah, quite a step up. Another game was Legend of Zelda,
Yes.
which that was an adventure game. It's like a top-down adventure game where, as in you're looking directly from above, and much like Pac-Man, in fact. But this was very different because you could move your character around through basically an open world full of monsters and dungeons and treasure, and it was really quite vast for
Yeah.
that.
It was the same as you have Metroid and Castlevania
Yeah,
and all those.
yeah,
That's when of course, and that as well. The main difference with the sort of adventure titles on the NES, the main difference with the Atari was that what you were looking at actually represented. You could see what was happening, what the images were representing, and it made
yeah,
it infinitely easier to navigate the game.
absolutely, and that was a step up, just apart from anything. I mean, it may look basic now, but I think perhaps the NES was the first console where you can still play it and think that looks like what it's meant to represent. I mean, you
There's
go
no
back,
leap of imagination.
no, you go back further than that, it's like, okay, this guy is he got a hat on? I'm not even sure.
Has he got a frisbee in his mouth?
it's, it's difficult to say. I was going to go on to mention Metroid because it was a platform game like Mario, except it had a much darker tone and it offered famously many different routes to find your goal. It was more of an expansive adventure. It was very atmospheric because your character, whose name was Samus,
Samus Aran, I think.
yeah, is stranded in this kind of alien environment, and it was quietly a bit of a breakthrough in video game gender politics because at the end of the game, your character removes her armor and to reveal she's a woman. So
Called Dave.
yeah, but the key character on the NES was Mario, who's
Yes,
became
definitely.
Nintendo's mascot, once named Jumpman, of course, as we explained last
From
time.
Donkey Kong, yes.
Yeah, he gradually became an Italian plumber with a brother named Luigi, etc. And he picked up a host of friends. And today, the main core series of Mario, so not including spin-offs, main core series has sold over 200 million units.
Bloody hell. I remember as well. I'm sure this would be going back a good 6, 7 years as well. That I think there was over 300 games of Mario or relating to Mario him
Wow.
featuring him, and that was then. So you're looking
Yeah.
at pretty close to.
I mean, he's
400
been
now.
shoehorned into a few games.
Yeah, but I
Sometimes.
can't think of anything pudgy Italian plumber can't do. So
So, weirdly, I just watched a video today of an interview with Shigeru Miyamoto, who is probably the most important person in video gaming. Do you remember that Japanese name, Shigeru Miyamoto? Because he basically created Mario,
Really?
and he was interviewed today, and he was busting a few of the myths about Mario.
Oh right.
And one of the questions was, when Mario hits a block to get a coin out of it, is he using his head or his fist? And he confirmed that yes, he's using his fist. It's a fist-based move. So it came from the original man himself. Okay, so that was great. NES was big time.
Yeah, yeah.
At the same time, there was a boom in the home computer industry. I think we should talk a little bit about
Well, the
home computers.
Amstrad, Commodore, and Spectrum, and
That's pretty much
yeah.
it. They were the three
Well,
big ones at the time. So I suppose I should explain what a home computer is as compared to a console first. So a console is a dedicated video games machine, whereas a home computer is usually more expensive, but it's more versatile. It's something that would be plugged into a dedicated monitor rather than a TV, and it would have a keyboard, a mouse or trackball, perhaps,
dot matrix printer.
dot matrix printer, sometimes a sound card. I'm not really sure about that, to be honest, at that stage, but better sound, and possibly even networking capabilities. In short, they could do more than play games.
Mm.
So,
But all I ever used them for was to play games.
yeah,
Yeah. My first computer actually was an Amstrad CPC 464,
all right.
and that was and I remember my friend had a Nintendo, like a NES, and I used to play games like The Curse of Sherwood and Death Wish 3, and I just thought that was a really grisly game for its time.
Yeah.
But of course, the loading times on the loading times were quite
Yeah.
magical. But then I remember going around my friend's house with a NES after I had my Amstrad,
Mm.
and he had a NES, and I remember thinking, well, why haven't you got a keyboard? Surely that's worse. Why, when I've got a joystick, why haven't
Yeah.
you know?
What I mean, one of the things about home computers, which differs from consoles as well. Consoles generally use cartridges, whereas the home computer would be a
Yeah,
cassette-based
yeah.
system or floppy disk. I think it's important, the fact that they were cassette-based or floppy disk, because they're two of the most volatile
Yeah, yeah.
storage mediums. Now, cassettes were a nightmare anyway because it took so long to load. You'd effectively be playing a tape,
Yeah.
waiting for it to load for what, minutes on end.
And some games had sort of level loading where it would load up the introduction screen,
Mm,
and then you'd press start, and then it would load the first level, and the tape would stop, and you'd finish the level, and you'd have to load the next one. So it
yeah.
wouldn't load the game up entirely at the
So
start
yeah, it
sometimes.
was it was it was hard work. And then you got floppy disks, which were
Are the most volatile.
I mean,
Yeah, because they demagnetize as well.
they
So
rarely worked at the time, let alone now.
yeah,
So it really means that they're extremely rare to get original games in that period for home computers. So we mentioned so we've got the Amstrad, what's the Amstrad CPC, we've got ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64.
there was the Commodore C16 and then the 64, but
Yeah,
64 was the big one.
yeah. So they were that was where it was all happening um, in the home computer market. But there's also the BBC Micro, which shouldn't be underestimated.
Wasn't that more of an educational system? I remember
It
that in my
was, it
school.
was, and indeed, as you mentioned that, the BBC Micro is apparently in 80% of schools in the mid 80s.
Really? Well,
Yeah,
that
it
explains
was
why.
big, and that was thanks to a government subsidy, actually. But I mean, although yeah, it wasn't specifically for gaming, it was how a lot of kids were introduced to gaming. I know.
Because maybe the parents couldn't afford. Because
Yeah,
they would have been a few £100 back in those
yeah,
days.
and I
So
mean they were quite educational based games, but they were kind of a lot of text adventures with graphics. And in North America, you had famously the Oregon Trail.
oh yeah, we died of dysentery and
Yeah, it
yeah,
was this kind of, I guess, adventure game where it has kind of sub games like hunting and things like
yeah.
that.
You're basically trying to survive the Oregon Trail
Yeah,
as the original settlers did.
yeah. So but apparently, 65 million kids played that. I mean,
Wow.
that would have been really a lot of coverage, and you know, that would have been maybe their first taste of gaming. But yeah, so that was happening at the same time. I mean, it wasn't until later in the decade when there was a huge step up in home computers in the form of it was a Commodore versus Atari battle between the Amiga 500 and the Atari ST, and that was about 87. I think the Amiga came out in 87, and they really dominated the home computer market at that point.
I only know, even to this day, I only know. At the time, I had a few friends and family members who had Amigas, the 500, 500 plus,
Mm.
600, 1200. And I only, to this day, know two people who had an Atari ST. And I just remember still being jealous of those people because they had Pang.
Well, Pang, we can maybe, if we can get some graphics, we can show exactly what that is,
Yeah.
because it's quite a unique game.
It's,
Yeah, but I mean, the thing is, the Atari was genuinely not as good in most
it
ways.
always struck me as a bit of a budget. I remember reading somewhere, and I do not know if this is true because I don't think I've ever actually played an Atari Beyond in my youth, like 15, 20 years ago. But I'm pretty sure that they didn't have parallax scrolling, which the Amiga did,
Mm,
or some sort of scrolling that they made, and it kind of it was just enough to sort of tip it. But the
mm,
graphics and the sound on the Amiga is amazing.
yeah, and it was. This is a thing because I mean, as it was a kind of new generation. This was a 16-bit generation. So it was a new generation of computers, and the jump from the previous generation, from the Amstrad, the Spectrum, the Commodore 64, was so massive.
Yeah.
I mean, they were so much more advanced, so much more powerful.
If the listeners actually, if they go on YouTube and to show the difference of quality, sound quality, if you go and type in Amstrad Robin Hood speech at the start of the game, I think it's the Oliver twins actually, and it says "Welcome to Robin Hood." It genuinely sounds like someone doing a zip up on a sleeping bag. It's like it's just nothing.
Oh my God, it was so bad. But I mean, then yeah, I mean the Amiga especially. I mean, we both had Amigas, so we
Yeah,
we know it, and it's like, I mean, it had digitized speech. It had speech which sounded like speech.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
People could record speech on it. It was amazing, and those computers. Um,
And I remember
They,
having that. Sorry, I can't remember what the program was called, where you could go into Workbench, which was
yeah,
the operating system of the Amiga, and you could type in sentences and it would read them back to you.
yeah,
I can't remember what that program was called, but that was the first time. I remember doing that for hours. Just like
yeah.
I'd like type out short stories and listen to it, read it back to me.
Definitely wouldn't type in any swear words at all.
Definitely never type swear words.
Um, and also they had these amazing peripherals. So you could peripherals being extra things you can add to the hardware of the computer. So it'd be extra disk drives to cut down on disk swapping,
Yeah.
expandable memory,
Hard drives.
hard
To install
drives. I mean,
games.
hard drives back then. I mean, now you've got hard drive. Your hard drive's like 500 gigabytes or a terabyte.
Yeah.
Back then, 20 megabytes was a big one.
I've got a magazine. I think it is an old Amiga Power magazine from like 1991 or something, and in the back of it, I love looking at the adverts, and at the
Mm.
back of it, it says you can buy a 20 megabyte hard drive for your Amiga for £400
For
with inflation,
that.
and of course, yes, you could buy dot matrix printers.
Yeah, it was brutal. It was for enthusiasts only, really, and you could
Yeah.
get a whole variety of gaming sticks as well.
I
Like,
never really had any peripherals for it beyond just the sort
mm.
of the Amiga itself.
This was really the generation of gaming where there was some early experiments in polygons as opposed to pixels
Mm.
and sprites. Now, I should explain what that means. A sprite is made up of pixels, as in the Adam Sandler movie.
Of course.
So a sprite is made up of pixels and it's a 2D animated shape. So when you think of Mario, we only see him from the side and he's animated, he runs along and jumps, etc.
And when you're playing Doom.
Yes. And then you've got polygons, which are different because they are flat planes which are connected together to create a fully formed kind of 3D model. Now, most major modern games use polygons, and they use enough polygons that they look almost lifelike now. But back then, 3D models were very basic, so
Mhm.
hopefully we can get some pictures of those.
I remember being on the subject of polygons, and
Mm,
if we can get a clip of it as well. I remember being absolutely blown away by no second prize on the Amiga 1200
mm,
because it was a racing game. It was a first-person racing game, and you controlled it with a mouse, which was really nice and smooth. And it was. I just remember being really surprisingly smooth. And the first
oh
time I'd
yeah,
ever seen polygons, and not thought that looks like a square.
yeah. Because I mean, a lot of time polygons are really power hungry because
Mm.
the computing power is going into creating something which isn't on a single plane. It's not just a 2D shapes shifting in one dimension along a plane.
Mm.
It's moving not just up and down, left and right, but into the frame, and it takes a lot of computing power.
And I don't know if you remember Hunter.
Yeah,
2 discs on the Amiga, and it was like a precursor to Grand Theft Auto.
yeah. So that was very open world.
Yeah.
And then of course, well, actually, I mean, I'm talking about Amiga 500 being like the era of like polygons, but actually the BBC had the game Elite, which was going to be a key game I was going to mention of that era
Yeah.
because Elite was a space trading game.
Was that wireframe?
Yeah, I think it was originally actually. It was
I've only seen pictures of it, so I'm just
a
trying.
wireframe is a kind of precursor to polygons, so it's like you've got the same kind of flat planes connecting things into a 3D shape, except they're not filled in
It's sort of
with
like the
colours.
skeleton of a
Yeah,
polygon.
yeah,
It's like the bones of a polygon, whereas
but still amazingly impressive. So yeah, I mean, I guess it was the first major polygonal release which actually was playable. Appeal of the home computer was to do with more power over the consoles, a keyboard and mouse, copyable discs.
piracy was rampant
Yeah, piracy
for the Amiga.
was big time because you could literally copy these discs from
Yeah.
one to another.
You wouldn't need any software.
Yeah, it was.
You'd get Xcopy for the Amiga, which you'd get off magazines.
Yeah, it was a big. It became a big issue. I mean, you had programming on those home computers. You had bulletin boards, which was a very early version of the internet. Um, and this kind of versatility continues today with modern PCs, although still the kind of plug in and play appeal of the dedicated games console is still lacking in PCs, frankly. I mean, it is still really for the enthusiast. It's getting better, but
Mm.
you don't have that kind of thing where you can just put the disc in, boot it up, and
And off you
go.
go.
Yeah. So yeah, I suppose key games of that era, of that home computer era in the late 80s would be, we mentioned Elite on the BBC. I'm gonna say The Secret of Monkey Island. A big step for,
Stunt
you
car
know,
racer,
Stunt Car Racer. That was a polygonal um,
racing game.
racing game.
Such a good game.
Such a beautiful game, and so much fun. And yeah,
Loom as well.
well, Loom, yeah, well, Loom and Secret of Monkey Island are quite closely entwined. They're both made by Lucasfilm, and I suppose together they were the first time we'd seen movie quality writing in games, which
Yeah,
hadn't
yes,
really been
yeah.
around before then. I mean, it was a real open world. It was deeply atmospheric and that, but also on top of that, the script was so good. It was an emphasis on humor, on story, and that it was something that you hadn't really had before.
Yeah, it was the perfect blend of sort of rich sort of storytelling and really sharp dialogue, but
Mm,
also with the mixture of the graphics. It was
mm.
almost like slapstick, and it was just a really nice meld of it.
Yeah, I mean, there were so many games back then which
Oh yeah.
really were mold breakers. I'd say something like Sim City would be.
Was that in the late 80s?
Yeah, that was. Yeah, that.
Wow. Oh
Yes.
god, yeah, I remember because you could. It was just cheat Amiga. You could make Godzilla come along and.
Well, yeah, you could. So to describe SimCity, well, how do you describe SimCity?
It's sort of an isometric world building game,
Yeah.
and it that pretty much kicked off. I mean, from that you got stuff like Populous and
Mm.
Megalomania and all those sort of isometric. They're called God games, aren't they?
Yeah, and I suppose gradually that led to stuff like The Sims now, which was quite a breakthrough in itself because it brought a new kind of audience to
That
gaming.
was Electronic Arts, wasn't it? I think they
Yeah, I
both
think so. Yeah, I think
SimCity.
they
Yeah,
were.
yeah,
Yeah. So SimCity, top down, you build a city
yeah,
basically, and you have to build power plants, and you have to deal with crime and
yeah.
pollution and stuff.
And it
And
has like Sim Train, Sim Ant.
Sim Ant, yeah, that's a
Yeah.
strange one, wasn't it? Yeah, so you had all these sim games, and these were called God games, and I suppose part of that was part of the appeal was the open-ended gameplay and the artificial intelligence factor.
And I suppose the fact that if you're building a city, you know that no one else is going to do it exactly the
Mm,
same as you've done.
yeah, it's very very unique to you. It's so much expression
Yeah.
of your own. Um,
Personally, I didn't have the patience for it. I used to
yeah,
much prefer playing colonization, where I would have men riding around on horseback loading muskets, and then they'd get attacked by laser tanks.
it's a reflection of the real world. Um, so yeah, we're just coming up to the end of this podcast. So yeah, we'll just sum up by saying that kind of the Amiga 500, we're kind of leaving it in the late 80s, early 90s. The
Yeah.
Amiga 500 and the Atari ST had a very successful rivalry,
Mm.
but it was still an enthusiasts kind of industry, wasn't it? I mean, gaming wasn't absolutely the commonplace home entertainment we
With,
see
with
today.
with the home computers though, with the one thing we did skim over was with the Amstrad, Commodore,
Mm,
and Spectrum was the main sort of three. That was also when you began to get serious home programmers,
mm,
and then they obviously started releasing games like the Oliver Twins came from
yeah,
that, and then with the Amiga. With how easy it was with copy protection and so on, and the power of it, the more advanced power, and it having an operating system workbench, that's when the public domain
yeah.
sort of gaming really took off as well.
So the public domain was where people would, like home developers, like basically kids in the bedroom really,
Yeah,
would be able to learn programming language and code their own games, and they'd either release them via bulletin boards or they would release them on the front of magazines on
yeah,
discs, and yeah, they were basically free games essentially just to show off their skills, sort of
yeah,
things. Um, and it was a really thriving industry for it. It was kind of like nowadays you call it the indie scene, that'd be the
yeah.
independent
With the
scene.
Xbox Live Arcade, yeah,
Yeah. So it's really making a comeback now. But it did die out in the 90s and 2000s
yeah.
for a while. But it really is making a comeback, which is good with the internet and that. So yeah, but at the time, I mean, it was still quite an enthusiast sort of arena. But everything would change in the early 90s because Sega and Nintendo were about to go to war. Okay, thanks everyone.
Bye bye.
Bye for now.